We are very happy today to introduce Dr. Torin Hopkins to give us a talk about his research work and vision for the future.
Nicely put. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Should I get started here?
Sure.
Well, hello. My name is Torin Hopkins, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you all today. It's great to be back at Atlas and see some friendly faces. So a little bit about me. I recently completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the National University of Singapore in the Department of Computer Science, studying AI with a focus on stroke rehabilitation. And I received my PhD from here at Atlas in creative technology and design, neuroscience and cognitive science, and where I engineered systems utilizing brain-computer interfaces, AI, and extended reality in musical contexts. And I have a background in human-computer interaction, neurobiology, medical imaging, and music. So my research area exists at the intersection of music, neuroscience, and computer science. And these are three topics that contribute knowledge to each other's respective disciplines. Music is an integral part of being human. It's a complicated practice that exhibits robust representations in the brain that cover a wide range of human cognitive processes, such as time perception and rhythm, linguistic processes, motor sequence learning, memory formation, and the ability to incite robust emotional experiences and responses. Music, it also lends itself easily to mathematics. Its structure can be quantized, efficiently compressed, and represented computationally, simplifying musical data analysis and AI. For example, musical frequencies follow discrete integer-like order, and complex musical sequences can be compressed into simpler computational representations that can be read and learned by computers. And advancements in both computational methods and neural imaging have created a landscape where fields like computational neuroscience have emerged, showcasing how computer science has advanced neuroscience, and sometimes even being used as a benchmark for how systems operate in the brain. So reciprocally, neuroscience has long informed computational methods, with inspirations from neuroscience being largely responsible for major recent breakthroughs in computational methods, particularly in AI. And my research interests lie in the discoveries, systems, and applications that result when AI and neuroscience are applied to musical contexts. And I'm particularly interested in how these two fields can be used to advance musical practice, musicianship, and performance. To frame this research, I'm going to discuss three projects that exemplify the bringing together of these three fields. And the first will be brain-computer interfaces for co-creative AI. And the second will be brain-computer interfaces for musical performance. And the third, I'll discuss ongoing work in AI-assisted music therapy. And afterwards, I'll talk a little bit about future directions. So I'll begin by discussing brain-computer interfaces, which are simply defined as systems that ascertain computationally meaningful information and represent it to a computer. So this in turn often affects some aspect of engineered systems, such as brain activity informing the AI drummer of what to play. And the project I'm about to describe isolated signals in the brain, machine learning algorithms to control the actions of an AI-driven virtual drummer. So this project began as I was in the process of building co-creative systems with AI-driven virtual musicians. And I began to ask, well, what creates a successful collaboration? And after joining and recording many types of jam sessions, I began to realize that musicians seem to have an ability to recognize when their playing wasn't quite right, and then simplify their musical output often in order to reset. And I thought, if this is possible, then perhaps there can be correlates in the brain that could represent this signal. And inspired by similar signals that can be easily ascertained in the brain, such as mismatch negativity, which is elicited when auditory stimulus feels out of place, early right anterior negativity, which is seen when higher order musical elements are unexpected, as well as activity and research active, like in improvisation and trust and reliability exhibited in human agent teaming studies. So I felt fairly confident that I'd be able to find a signal that when musicians were feeling off about the improvised jam session with an AI-driven virtual musician system, and we termed this rhythmic reliability, or predictability rather, sorry. We began with two research questions. One is, can we find the neural correlates of rhythmic predictability in the brain using FNIRS? And if we can, what's the optimal method for classifying brain states in real time? So we settled on FNIRS as an imaging modality due to its ecological validity, portability, robustness to motion, sweat, electromagnetism artifacts, and also given we were looking for a signal specific to brain regions, FNIRS was an optimal choice due to its region specificity. And we settled on a montage imaged above to cover the brain regions of interest for rhythmic predictability. And yeah, so if you saw in that shower cap, it's that's the FNIRS machine, and it's located underneath that cap there. That's just to block the light, because the light signal that's coming in is what's actually doing the reading. So to isolate the signal, we brought in 2 musicians for 3 hours each and exposed them to 3 distinct conditions with aims to create a bespoke model for each musician. The aim here was to see if we could use the brain signal when a virtual musician was creating beats that were not predictable or off in a musical sense. As shown here, on the spectrum of predictability, you can see that on the far left, there's a representation of programmatically randomized beats. And these were difficult to jam with, as shown in the video here. And if you watch the virtual drummer, you can see when they sporadically hit the drum. So this is a bit of a glorified example of what unpredictability looks like, but we wanted to get a good measure of it. So then in the middle, we exposed the musicians to pre-selected musical beats that represented music you might hear people jamming with. And these were easy to jam with, as shown in the back and forth between the virtual musician and the human drummer. And in the third condition, we exposed the musicians to metronomic playing, which provided a steady pulse of drum beats as seen in the video. Though relatively uninteresting, the beats formed a stable rhythm. So you could track the virtual musician. If you see here, they're playing a steady pulse along with the beat. And during this period, we also employed best practices for controls between rest conditions, using fixation crosses to stabilize the human dynamic response signal over time. And our goal was to distinguish between these states such that if the virtual musician thought it was playing musical beats, but actually approached non-musical beats per the brain signal, we could switch to a highly reliable approach of simple metronomic beats in response. So building the system came with its challenges. For one, we had to get the signal from the FNIRS into a clean format for the machine learning model, which was going to be streamed and classified in real time. So this entailed turning the raw microvoltage data into figures that accurately represented the levels of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin. And this entailed getting the data from the FNIRS device into MATLAB, and then running a bandpass filter and manually replicating the Beer-Lambert law, which accounts for the absorption coefficients of hemoglobin, or the molecules that are in the brain that pass oxygen through, and also the path distance between the source and detector on the FNIRS device on this incoming data stream. So this we could eventually put into the musically relevant interval for training our machine learning model. And after collecting the data, we noticed that the deoxygenated hemoglobin figures were much more stable than the oxygenated ones, which is consistent with current literature in FNIRS. And we compared several machine learning models and found that the random forest model performed the best compared to others mentioned in relevant literature. So for musical tasks, this would be with the convolutional neural network and long short-term memory recurrent neural networks, as well as support vector machines. And we also measured a few others that aren't pictured here. So then we decided to take the average of the deoxygenated hemoglobin just to see what would happen and plot it over the trial duration period. And this ended up actually yielding a significant difference between the musical beats condition and the metronome and the random beats condition by quite a wide margin. So you can see the random in the green, and then the blue and orange are both the music and metronomic. So which are much more closely related than the randomized one. So though the goal was not cross-validation, but individualized models for each musician, we still processed the data to see if we could find any patterns of activation. And our findings from post hoc analysis supported the current literature with activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which you'll see here, and activation for the musical and metronome condition. And interestingly, though the musicians were improvising in every condition besides the control, the randomly generated drum beats did not show the same pattern of activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but instead showed activation in brain areas more closely associated with workload, imaged here, and suggesting that improvisation alone may not activate this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as mentioned in the literature, or other associated communication areas of the brain, but requires this human-like virtual musician to produce intelligent responses. So also of note is the temporal parietal junction activation, which is all these down here. And this wasn't in the musical condition more robustly than the other two, which shows far greater activation than in either the metronome condition or the randomly generated drum beats condition. In this area, the brain is associated with social recognition and mentalizing, suggesting that when the players are interpreting and improvising with music, the social cognition areas of the brain are a bit more active. And then we implemented this in, we implemented the random forest model in our real-time system, and this is ultimately the system diagram. And we utilized a binary classifier that would classify the musical versus non-musical states, and it began with our signal, the F-near signal up here, and then we classified it using the random forest algorithm. And then after this, if the classification showed non-musical beats, then we would change it up. And then and then we change it up to a metronome to sort of stabilize that signal, and then eventually kind of turn back to a more musical beat so that we could sort of optimize for the musicality in the system. And I don't have a clip where it's making like really horribly unpredictable beats, but here's a short clip of the system where it starts to become a little less predictable. See, it was kind of like juxtaposed to what was going on with the drummer. And then what would happen is the signal would be sent and then it would switch to something that was a bit more stable. In this case, if you're familiar with music, it's 8 notes or just sort of like a subdivision of 2 on you can see it's a little easier to jam with. And we found that players did feel that reverting to a stable beat was when the beats were getting a little complex or too much, that it felt natural and easy, kind of similarly to how jam sessions would go in real time. And based on the interviews and questionnaires following each condition, we found that players felt more listened to in the F-nears informed condition, but abrupt changes in either condition were untenable and required smoother transitions. So perhaps back to the previous beat or sustaining the beat for longer to improve the system. And even though the system could recognize this instability, it should not take immediate action in our system. And this was every 4 bars or roughly 11 seconds in the way that we built it. So instead, changes should likely be occurring over longer periods of time, enabling players to regroup and kind of jam with something that's a bit. Now, future research will include incorporating more participants into the study to see if cross-validation is possible, as well as further validating the rhythmic predictability network, and also building a closed loop system for optimization of drum beats that corresponds to improved predictability rather than switching. So rather than changing it up, we want to be able to optimize in a fluid manner in a closed loop system. So that's optimizing the model while they're actually playing with it. And then through the metric of rhythmic predictability, as measured through this process, yields a reliable and classifiable signal. But replicating findings in technologies like EEG would not only corroborate our evidence, but potentially make the system more accessible to other researchers and musicians. And moving past this project, future research with these systems should encompass other brain regions and signals associated with collaboration. By better understanding how people think and respond in a jam session, we can replicate these behaviors in AI-driven systems, making them more social and adaptive. And we can also leverage these signals to enhance human-to-human collaboration by utilizing brain-computer interfaces to provide insight for human collaborators, that they would otherwise not have access to. And now I'll discuss a musical performance that incorporates signals of rhythmic predictability to promote interaction between audience and performer. All right, so Synesthesia is a multimedia immersive performance held in the Black Box Studio here at Atlas. And it brought together a multidisciplinary team of 8 scientists and technologists to design, create, and manage the complexity of running a brain-computer interface mediated performance. So the aim of this performance was to challenge the traditional roles of the audience and performer by inviting the audience members to play with me, the performer. And the agency in most performances lies solely in the performer while the audience watches. However, in Synesthesia, the amount of control or agency I had, or the audience had, was mediated by my sense of rhythmic predictability or coherence. And the performance unfolded in an 8-step process by the predictability state, which was registered and was also represented as the size of the orb behind me. At the beginning of every jam, the audience members were invited to choose a color on the stations that were active, and those colors later made up the visuals around the room. So the colors chosen also corresponded to chords that I had memorized, so every jam was unique and was initially shaped by the audience's choice. Next to the color stations were rhythmic instruments, and the audience members could play and participate in the jam. And during the jam, rhythmic predictability was measured using an FNIRS device, assessing every 10 seconds or so, and reflecting the measurement in the size of the orb located behind me. When the jams came to a close, every 3 to 10 minutes, the system would assess the overall level of rhythmic predictability of the jam, activate or deactivate the stations based on these levels. So if the audience members were jamming and cohering well with me and each other, more stations would become active, and if not, then the drums and color choices would slowly be taken away from them, giving me as the performer more musical agency. Several occurrences were surprising in this performance. So for example, people started overriding my control in unforeseen ways, which happened to occur naturally throughout the performance. So as you'll see shortly, people are stomping their feet, clapping their hands, banging on chairs and the ground to become further involved. And this created a unique communal atmosphere at the show, which audience members were taking turns to choose colors, showing each other how to play the drums, and establishing crosstalk between me and the audience as well as other members. So here's an example of the jam during the show, or a jam during the show, and you'll see by the size of the orb, I'm feeling pretty good about it. And just about all 6 stations are active. So you may also be able to hear that I begin to try to push the tempo a little bit during this particular jam, and the other drummers followed quite successfully, further contributing to the size of the orb. You may recognize the people. Here they are flying, stopping their feet. Everything's kind of happening at the same time. There's the chair.
Just a really quick question.
Sure.
Since you showed that video, what was your role, if there was one, for integrating the different inputs? You had foot pedals, or did you set an automatic free running system to integrate the other inputs, or was it guided by ML, or how did that work?
Yeah, for the most part, it was just running automatically. But what you'll see here is there's a couple people sitting behind me, operating, making sure that all of the systems are running smoothly. We had our FNIRS expert here, who was looking at the screen, but it was basically all she was doing was saying like, okay, the jam ended, we're moving on to the next one. And then it was sending the signal back to actually Sweetie, who was sitting in the back, and that was controlling the projections back here. You might also notice that there are some microphones that I didn't mention next to the instruments. And those are just picking up the audio and making kind of like reverberations in the colors that were associated with each one of those stations. So overall, it was just running an algorithm that was coming out, and then
So, an open loop, or free running algorithm.
Yeah.
That was the problem.
yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
People online cannot hear the sound, so you might have to.
Oh, that's too bad. All right, hold on a second. I must have forgot to share myself.
Maybe Zoom and share sound. But or you can also give the YouTube link in the end. I'm saying that if
Yeah.
you do another presentation.
Yeah, too bad, guys.
Yes.
Here, do you want to just hear this briefly?
All right, I see.
So I assume we can do a video for the hour. Alright, cool. Alright, cool. And then, as shown previously in the brain-controlled AI-driven virtual musician project, rhythmic predictability measurements could be accomplished by simply taking the average of those channels, which is what was occurring here. And this enabled us to provide a range from 1 to 6. That being, rather than simply just classifying the brain state as musical or non-musical, these ranges corresponded to the stations that became available to the audience during the performance, and they fluctuated throughout the whole bit. All right, so there are a lot of possibilities with future research involving brain-computer interfaces and performances. For example, in other shows, I've performed with AI-driven virtual musicians. Shown here, we did this in London in a cool old Gothic church. It's kind of fun. But anyway, the brain-computer interfaces could be incorporated to either control or mediate aspects of the performance, such as audience participation or the output of the AI-driven performer. And ultimately, these performances rely on the types of signals that can be ascertained by the brain. And then those are what's leveraged to create the actual particular performance paradigm. And moving on to my third line of research, which I initiated in my postdoc, it's the potential effect of music therapy in a health setting with patients. So this work is ongoing. And so we're in the process of data analysis now, but I'll discuss just what it took to understand the problem here and how we approached it. So this project specifically looked at stroke patients and the potential for using AI-assisted music therapies and rehabilitation. And I led a team of 10 people and partnered with the School of Medicine at the National University of Singapore, which included experts in neuropsychology, medicine, and computer science. And we also were fortunate to have the opportunity to work with stroke patients directly, caregivers of those stroke patients, music therapists, and healthcare professionals specializing in stroke rehabilitation. So for those who are unfamiliar, a stroke is defined as a bleeding or blockage in the brain of blood flow in the brain ultimately, but these disruptions can cause large areas of brain cells to unfortunately die, resulting in major cognitive impairments such as loss of limb function, speech and language difficulties, loss of memory, and other cognitive impairments. And just to frame this, 1 in 4 adults over the age of 25 will have a stroke in their lifetime, so it's pretty widespread. And in 2023, just in the US alone, there were 795,000 reported strokes, and 20% unfortunately passed, and another 80% were in the process of recovery, making stroke a leading cause of serious long-term disability worldwide. and likely attributed to the widespread distribution of music in the brain, as well as its deep connection to emotional responses and the robustness of what's coded in the brain. Music is often used as a low-risk intervention for alleviating the cognitive impacts of stroke, often delivered through the care of a music therapist. Specifically in the context of Singapore, this work was advocating for the use of music therapy in clinical and at-home settings. And unlike many other places in the world, music therapy is not yet recognized there as a subsidized health treatment for stroke and is often too expensive for patients to participate in. But the benefits here are that music therapy is substantial, and it's been demonstrated to significantly improve depression symptoms as well as speech and language impairments, which are two cognitive aspects that alone contribute to 60 and 30% of stroke patients respectively. And these operate through fairly well-known mechanisms. For example, Broca's aphasia or impairments in the speech production overlap with areas associated with music production. However, whereas speech is most often left lateralized in the brain, music representations are often represented in both hemispheres, making techniques like melodic intonation therapy an effective strategy for circumventing these affected speech areas by better enabling patients to overcome this aphasia. So again, our aim was to create AI-assisted music therapies. However, given the vulnerability of our stakeholders and complexity of the task, I felt we needed to undertake a qualitative approach to be empathetic to our stakeholders to begin this. So this is an essential step when designing for vulnerable populations, as not doing so can lead to technologies can actually do more harm than good in these populations. And so we're in the process of the phase 2 of this approach here, and we're in data analysis. So I'll just share as much as we've been able to get done up to this point and describe what we hope to accomplish in this project. So in the first phase, we began with interviews with 21 stakeholders for about an hour in each. It was about 50 minutes to an hour and a half. And this was in an effort to better understand our stakeholders, and we held these interviews just to uncover several aims, chief among them being, what are the challenges that they experience? How is music therapy perceived generally by our stakeholders? And how is technology utilized in the context of stroke rehabilitation? And answering these questions might give us a better idea of what we needed to do, what we needed to avoid, and how we needed to deliver it. So after the interviews, we conducted an inductive thematic analysis, giving us a much better understanding of our stakeholders and their needs. For example, we found an incredibly high prevalence of depression and feelings of worthlessness in people who experienced a stroke, as well as the need to consider the time and energy of caregivers, and the incredible diversity of tactics that are needed to deliver individualized care among therapists and healthcare providers. Some views on music therapy were very positive, with stroke patients often using music as a tool to regulate emotions on their own, saying things like, I think music can help release your pent-up emotion. Though privacy for patients was also a concern, as they were easily embarrassed by their diminished ability, and this was particularly exacerbated in a musical context, which people often already feel a little bit embarrassed about. So we also found that the use of technology is welcomed by all stakeholders, so long as the setup time was short and provided as a tool to supplement ongoing therapy practice or daily life. And the type of technological intervention for elderly and young stroke patients would likely be very, very different. In the second phase, we began an ideation process with our stakeholders. So that's generating ideas collectively together. And we asked two fundamental research questions. How might we design a novel music technology using generative AI to alleviate the cognitive impact of stroke that combines stroke rehabilitation and music therapy? And what are the design implications of generative AI tools for enriching rehabilitation experiences for stroke patients? For this, we did time sketching or verbal ideation, depending on their ability, for roughly 8 different ideas. And then we spent time discussing those ideas afterwards, expanding on the important components, what they felt were important to carry forward into such technologies, and created branches for possible future directions for our evaluative application. And so again, this research is ongoing, but we're currently in the process of analyzing our data for phase 2 And this will inform a prototype, which we will iterate upon, and then eventually conduct an 8-week randomized controlled trial and then deploy in the medical or at-home settings. All right, so now let's discuss a little bit about feature research in music, minds, and machines. Okay, so also in the health domain, there's an important group that can benefit from AI-assisted tools potentially dementia and Alzheimer's. And music has been shown to elicit these memories, as I mentioned earlier, and bring life back to many who have difficulty with a sense of their personhood and past life. Building on work done with some of my colleagues at NUS, an interesting direction would be to quickly reconstruct a historical narrative with the inclusion of imagery and music to reminisce in their past. Careful consideration of the design and implementation of such technology could also be important here to ensure patients and other stakeholders are receiving this type of care in the way that best fits their current situation. And as I had mentioned, further work on passive brain-computer interfaces for co-creative AI systems enhance collaboration between human AI collaborators, but could also enhance human-to-human collaborations. And some of the prior work that we've done has shown that not all musicians are privy to the communication attempts that each other are making during a jam session. So potentially systems could be able to sense cognitive states or communication mechanisms that some other players have more difficulty with and sort of give people inclination of what's happening in each other's minds while they're playing. Brain-computer interfaces for explicit control are also possible rather than passive. And musical systems leveraging areas of the brain associated with motor control and is another important direction. And these can not only be used to further enhance co-creative AI systems for musicians or rehabilitative settings, but can help unencumber musicians during the composition practice processes. So for example, it may be possible to train models to recognize mental elements that are distinct from common musical actions, such that musicians can control aspects of the musical environment simply by imagining them. This would require more robust but similar experimental procedures to what I've done before, and more sophisticated models and training protocols. And such systems would actually require better labeled databases that are tokenized efficiently to enable these interactions, inspired by some prior research that we've done with my colleagues at the National University of Singapore and tokenization schemes for music output. A similar process would provide flexible databases that could move beyond classification and train models to be used in myriad ways, including passive or explicit control of music systems, or possibly also be coupled with flexible musical generation models. And in addition, ecological neuroimaging can be used to measure the efficacy of music education tools, and real-time systems could similarly measure workload and create adaptive systems to optimize learning outcomes based on desired difficulty levels. Sorry, this is my last slide. To conclude, music, neuroscience, and computer science act synergistically to mutually support discoveries in each field. These discoveries, in turn, provide new possibilities for science and creative systems, enabling a process by which we not only understand more about music, neuroscience, and computer science, but also about ourselves and our creative capabilities. And with that, I want to thank my collaborators and for your time for my talk today. Yeah, good question.
Sure. Really, really great presentation. There were a whole bunch of different domains that you were applying these concepts to, and it seemed like the rehabilitation and the medical applications was like one of your more recent ones, where you're looking at stroke rehabilitation, Alzheimer's, and dementia. Have you looked into different offerings in that space, like product offerings such as like MedRhythms or Beats Medical? Just are you aware of any of that that's happening for actually a broader scale treatment? Because these sorts of approaches are actually in some cases registered and listed with FDA as like biofeedback treatments, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the research that we were doing, we were focusing largely in Singapore, China, and some of the East Asian countries. And a lot of those technologies were like in their initiation stages, so they were out there. Music therapists were using them. Like for instance, in Australia, they have these really interesting mechanisms that they use for patients just generally. Like everybody has their own music players and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's so many out there that in order to really get started on a lot of that, beyond what we've done, we would need to look into all of the offerings, not only research, but also what's going on in the business sphere. So yeah, I'm familiar with a fair amount of them, but I don't think by any stretch of imagination I understand what's completely out there, I understand the full space.
And I was mostly asking in terms of like, if that space was one you were considering pursuing at this point.
Oh, like creating a company or something like that?
No, I'm sorry, just, you know, pursuing the medical treatment element of it as opposed to the performance and expression.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I think the things that are really interesting to me are kind of the fact that depression is so relevant because it's 60% of stroke patients are contributing largely to that state. I feel like music can really help in that domain. As far as like medical, like how the medical field could actually be used by that, I think depression is one of those things that can be, as well as speech and aphasia. I think those are relevant ones. But you know, there's so many different medical conditions and so many applications here. There's just a rich space to explore. So yeah,
Thanks.
hopefully we can continue through with that. Sorry, I know you had a question.
By the way, I'm Dan.
Hi, Dan.
And really appreciated your presentation. Sorry, I was a little late, everybody. I just wanted to bring something up and get your feedback. A lot of times when you're, and this has to do with implementation, whatever the technology is. A lot of times when you're creating value with the technology or an integration of technology, and there's a big enough benefit, an obvious benefit, like medical benefits, for instance, or financial benefits, or whatever it is, people usually get together and self-organize, if you will, and create technical standards or de facto standards or alignments so that costs can be lowered, the technology complexity can be lowered, it becomes more accessible. I'd be very curious to know, and this is the reason I raised my hand before your room was done. I'd be curious to know why it was, and if it's in the context that I just mentioned, that you're tokenizing the music information. Are you tokenizing it because it's maybe more prepared for quantum state computing? Are you tokenizing it because it's just easier to secure, or is it a vector database that you're using that makes the most sense given the application? I'd love to hear just a quickie.
Yeah, sure. The tokenization is preparing it for machine learning or AI models, right? So just as a quick show here, I wasn't applying this generally to the rehabilitation space, but it could be theoretically. So in this particular tokenization schematic, we're adding history and context directly into an octuple middle MIDI system. And what this enables is where you can provide context to many different instruments within a single MIDI file, right? And that means that you can take a MIDI file and then all of a sudden create a whole band arrangement, or you could take a whole band arrangement and reduce it into a piano score, or you can have a drum arrangement or something.
The beauty of the MIDI standard, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, tokenization at some level, if you do it properly, enables you to have just many more applications. So I wasn't thinking about it specifically applied to anything as much as I was that these databases are going to need to be dealt with in a way that's really efficient to make those happen.
Well, that's the commonality built with that tokenization is a really important piece of the puzzle, and transcends quantum. It transcends cryptographic use, and it's definitely the lingua franca of the next century. So and just really quickly, this has standards and value written all over it for people. It's It's a really great line of research, and I commend you for pursuing this. This is impressive.
Thank you. I mean, I was just lucky enough to work with people who had access to all of these collaborators, and like otherwise it would have been very difficult for me to actually pursue that.
Who organized that, the co-creation workshop you had, just out of curiosity? Was that you or somebody else?
I mean, I organized the project, so Professor Ye Wong and Catherine Dong at National University of Singapore were working together to try to do something. And rather than just create a technology and just put it in front of people, I was there to facilitate that and figure out how do we ideate, how do we think about the stakeholders in a way that could produce a meaningful technology for them.
Really great. Thanks.
Yeah. I'm just curious about the last part with the stroke victims. You mentioned, I think Australia, they have their own players. Does this mean the patients are, I don't want to say passive listening because they're probably active listening, but they're just listening, or are they actually participating and like making music as well?
Well, in Australia, those particular players were just passive, which isn't as common, I guess, like in hospital systems here that I'm aware of, at least not in Singapore. And there are, like specifically in South Korea, there's a ton of technology that's coming out to support stroke rehabilitation. I mean, even in Singapore, there's like robotics and other things like that that are more mechanically oriented to help like limb motion. But yeah, in terms of actually interacting with the music, that's generally within the domain of music therapists, which, like I mentioned, is devoid for the most part in Singapore, but is really present in places like South Korea. So we were working with music therapists there to get a sense of what they do and how they do it. And actually, some neuropsychology or psychiatry with respect to, I don't know if it was melodic intonation therapy or one of the more prominent therapies was actually developed by a guy up in Fort Collins, I think.
That's good stuff. But besides cognitive stroke victims, just like paralysis and how they, I was looking at the picture of the guitar and the clarinet, and I was trying to figure that out.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see what's possible, right? I mean, so are you thinking of like this one?
Yeah, if that's the therapy, the violin's hard.
Yeah, I mean,
Hard if your left side wasn't paralyzed.
it's true. I think ultimately, like one of the biggest struggles with this technology is that, people can, you've probably seen Neuralink, like they can move around cursors and they can do fun stuff like that. And those algorithms that they're using are incredibly basic, but the trade-off is they have to get incredibly invasive. So there's this sort of trade-off between like, how deep do you want to go into someone's brain? And in what level of resolution can you look at in order to ascertain a signal that's meaningful? And I think it's an interesting space and a really important space to look into how do we do that non-invasively. And ultimately, motor control, whenever you go to, like, say I was to pick up this marker, there's a premotor, or you can see here in the premotor cortex, before it actually reaches the spot of the brain in the primary motor cortex where it commits that action into a nerve that translates into that grasping motion, you have this sort of pre-planned stuff that's going on. So the brain is always sort of simulating your motor actions. This is even also what's happening when you're hearing that rhythmic predictability. It's like your body is actually simulating that in a place called the supplementary motor area, which is actually pictured right there. So it's not impossible to do that kind of thing. And if you can get somebody to imagine it, or if you can find representations that are common enough in the brain that elicit those motions, and then you're able to take that signal, then maybe you could get something to happen without people actually having to think about it, right? So you think about like everybody playing music, and some people are like putting their feet and their hands and they're doing all this stuff. Like there's potential that any one of those things can be added on upon, right? So if you can imagine some movement that you're not actually currently doing, potentially that could be utilized. So there's something like that is what could be interesting to look into further.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit? I'd love to hear some of your early findings in the phase 2 study of this postdoc research, and kind of what you're interested in pursuing for rehabilitative therapies, and how you anticipate to use generative AI music. Do you plan to do a similar kind of implementations as what you're doing with AI drummer? I would love to hear this AI guitar player. I don't know if we've got a sample of that, but I'm curious about how that jam is. I guess I'd like to hear more about how you are considering implementing generative music for some of this stuff.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, I do have that, so I just, let me see if we can do this and then maybe I can unmute. Oh, come on.
That's cool. And that's not with the FNIR.
No,
That's
not at all. So yeah, the way that this is done is, this is a MIDI guitar.
gotcha.
So it's taking the MIDI output directly, which is about like a 5
CU
millisecond
alert test.
latency.
This is a test of the CU Boulder emergency notification system.
What's that?
This is
Yeah.
only a test.
Oh,
No
okay.
action is required. This is only a test.
Don't wanna play out. All right. It's a good thing we get those, you know.
Hijacked.
We go boy.
Big brother.
My phone was looking awesome. But, sorry, I will answer your question with respect to the stroke rehabilitation, but just like to demonstrate that system was MIDI plugged in, and then it had a pre-trained kind of soloist. And then it was taking that and then outputting solos in real time and trying to time lock that.
Cool.
Also
with that randomized forest or the.
No, that was actually a neural network,
Okay.
short-term memory and one. So that deals more with like the sequential data inputs that are happening. But yeah, now there's all sorts of fun transformers. This was done a while back where those weren't so accessible to us. But yeah, it'd be fun to do another iteration. Yeah, okay. I don't want to get myself in trouble here because a lot of this is ongoing work, right? But I guess I could give like a little bit. So it was interesting, like the stroke patients, the caregivers, the music therapists, and the healthcare providers all ideated in very different ways. So they all have a very different relationship to stroke. I mean, they're all familiar with what it is, but they all were branching out in many different ways. For instance, like music therapists were really interested in showing us like how they think about like the mathematical space of music therapy, etc. So that could inform how the AI system actually is implemented at some strategic and computational level. Whereas stroke patients were more looking at like, what is my actual difficulty in using technology, and then how can I actually see that existing in my life, which is really pertinent. Then also you have like medical professionals who have limited time to actually do something, and they want to be able to use this directly into their practice, and they're interested in breaking the mold and doing whatever they can to implement an AI assisted technology, some of which are actually already utilizing some aspects of like GPT and stuff to try to stay on the cutting edge, to develop new exercises. For instance, like stroke patients need to say like phrases like, I want to go to the bathroom, you know, and because they can't move themselves there. And then if they have aphasia, they have a hard time saying that. So they have to practice in speech therapy, like I want to, or just bathroom or whatever it is, right? So if you figure out what it is that they're trying to learn, and then you can develop all these exercises to work through the phonetics of an actual word. And so like GPTs can be used to work around that. And then, yeah, like caregivers, they want to do anything they can for their loved ones. So it's like, yeah, anything that you could put in their hands it's important to know, I think. Especially if it doesn't make drive the whole wall or make them drive a million miles to go do it.
Yeah. So you're thinking, this is a difficult challenge to meet all of the needs and interests of these stakeholders.
Yeah,
To
ultimately,
provide something that's humane and robust and practical.
ultimately, there's not gonna be a one size fits all solution, I can tell you that much. Yeah, and I need to develop very bespoke little technologies that will help.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anything else?
Just one last curiosity question. The closed loop system, that you described and then for future work. Don't get into the details, but I'm just curious to understand, is really a closed loop system in this context about some sort of arbiter of how to reintegrate information on a sort of ongoing time basis? Or how would you describe a closed loop system for these kinds of applications?
Yeah, so what that would look like is you would tie the musical output to the actual improvement of the brain state. So rather than just like,
To the benefit.
right, so rather than just reading the brain state and then be like, okay, fix it. You do like read the brain state and then optimize for the actual rhythm.
That was the thing I was looking for.
Yeah.
You're getting this technology innovation, but you're able to optimize it in some way, in some fashion, using some tooling.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea.
Wonderful.
I'll just stew for like a second.
It seems like you're going deep into the medical field right now, but are there any ideas or curiosities you have in the entertainment and collective improvisation projects that are kind of piquing your curiosity right now?
Yeah, I mean, Sweeby and I, and actually David participated, and then it was a compositional mixed reality tool, which I think would be really fun. It showed a lot of promise. We conducted kind of a similar experimental program where we had people speculate about what it is that their musical setup was, and then how a virtual reality system or mixed reality system could help that.
Wow.
And we found like so many different directions that we could go that it's almost, we just have a backlog, I think, at this point. But in terms of brain computer interfaces, there's a lot of potential to control things. So like while you're composing music, generally what happens is people are sitting at a desk and then they have like a guitar, if or a violin or whatever it is, like all the different instruments have various like constraints. But when you use mixed reality, what you're able to do is kind of like stand up and move about your space and kind of control things. But then you have your hands, right? So it's always about like, well, what are we controlling? How do we maximize the amount of, I guess, control over the compositional experience in a way that can help people not have like a million, perhaps like hardware gadgets that cost tens of thousands of dollars a piece, and how would you be able to like port that into something that someone could just throw on in their bedroom and then have access to a full suite of tools that maybe is located elsewhere, and then control it in a way that's super fun and cool and interesting and a limited room.
Right.
That's just cool
Yeah.
places to go.